Well, hello to everybody out there joining us here for this C4 webinar. My name is Vaughn Bryant. I'll be the presenter today, and I am glad that you made it in. I see that we have 12 participants, 13, 14. It's really a lot of people are jumping on right now, so I'll start with a brief introduction about who I am. As I said, my name is Vaughn Bryant. You can see there from the PowerPoint presentation, which I understand C4 will be sending out to everybody after the conclusion of the presentation. I am a marriage and family therapist. I'm also a approved supervisor. I am a licensed professional counselor as well as approved supervisor. I'm a LCDC, licensed chemical dependency counselor, and I'm a certified clinical supervisor with that as well. And I'm here at the J. Flowers Health Institute. I'll give you a slide, tell you a little more about J. Flowers Health Institute. We specialize in providing truly comprehensive health and wellness evaluations for individuals who want to improve their quality of life. Every client receives personal one-on-one concierge care service and luxury accommodations and a workable plan for future health. We utilize the full benefit of being here in the major metro area of Houston, Texas, which really is the epicenter of some very comprehensive and progressive health interventions. We have one of the largest medical centers here, the Texas Medical Center, which includes hundreds of different hospitals and specialty clinics. What we do here at the J. Flowers Health Institute is we take a deep dive into every case to try to identify what are the issues, whether they be physical, medical, biological, relational, personality, substance use disorders. And we work out a plan of care to really help people achieve wellness in their life. So that's me right here from the J. Flowers Health Institute. I'm actually overlooking, we're up on the 23rd floor here in Houston, Texas, near the what we call the Uptown area. I can see that the traffic has begun to really pick up in the last few days. And I know that many of you and your communities are beginning to experience that increase in activity as hopefully things begin to move back to normal. One of a few presentations, a few webinars that I've done recently, one of them was about technology assisted services. And many of us, I would almost say all of us who are currently practicing mental health care over the last couple months have become familiar with using telemedicine or teletherapy, to use a platform like the one we're using today, Zoom, to be able to reach out and provide mental health services to people wherever they may be by technology services. And that's the way we're doing the seminar today, this webinar. Many of you, I'm sure, look forward to going, whether it was across town or across the country, to different events, conferences. I know C4 does a number of those, and it is great to get around with other people in the field, share ideas, have interactive discussion. And we're doing that now here with the Zoom platform. I will tell you a couple things about the Zoom platform. I do believe you can see my screen right here. We have a Q&A option. So if you will move your mouse up there to the Q&A, and if you had a question, you could drop that question in there. I'm going to move this away. One other thing that I'd like to say about technology is that technology is great, particularly when it works. And I know sometimes people might have challenges with technology, whether the audio or video drops out. I'm seeing that all systems are go on my end. If any of you want to just try using the Q&A right now and just give me a question, actually you don't have to ask a question, but do say, Dr. Bryant, we hear you and see you loud and clear. I would be affirmed by hearing that, because I've been talking now for about 5 minutes as the participants have made their way online. All right, one question. I see 2 of them have popped up. I hear you and see you. That's wonderful. Okay, you can You can stop now. I've received 6 affirmations of that. I really appreciate that. But that's how to use the Q&A. If you have a question emerge during the presentation, I'm going to take a time, probably about every 10 minutes or so, to look at the Q&A. I'm going to be talking about the laws of family process today. I'll give you a little introduction about my entry into family therapy. When I was an undergraduate, I knew very clearly that I wanted to be a psychologist. That's what I learned in high school, taking one of those vocational assessments. And so I started off with my bachelor's degree in psychology, and I started my master's degree in psychometrics. Psychometrics is that specialization in mental health where we use standardized testing to try and gather a lot of data about a person's emotional, behavioral, psychological functioning. And the key is the standardized testing. We do a lot of psychometrics here at the J. Flowers Health Institute to really give us confirmation of some of those clinical hunches that we have. And also it helps to maybe identify things that we may had missed. And I really enjoyed psychometrics. I learned to be quite proficient at it. And then a major life change happened to me. I fell in love and was beginning to contemplate this idea of marriage. And since I had room for 1 or 2 electives, I decided to take a family therapy class when I was working on my master's in psychometrics. It was a master's in clinical psychology. And I took a family systems theory class, and it completely changed the way I thought about psychopathology. And it felt so much more consistent with my belief and understanding about the role an individual plays, or shall I say, the influence that context and the social environment and the culture, the family of origin, plays in the life of the individual. And I decided to switch my major, and I ended up finishing my master's degree in marriage and family therapy. And although I am a licensed professional counselor and I'm a licensed chemical dependency counselor, I really do identify as MFT, a marriage and family therapist. And my approach to understanding and conceptualizing problems is very significantly informed by family systems theory. I did see a couple questions pop up. I'm going to take a look at that real quick. I'll go ahead and remove them. I think all of those were ones that came from earlier. So I'll tell you about the presentation today. I will present this in 2 modules. Module 1, I'm going to give you an overview of family systems theory, talk about some fundamental principles of family systems theory, and then I'm going to discuss the laws of family process. Actually, there's 10 of them, but 2 of them are on 1 slide. So if you're thinking 10, you're going to see 9 slides on the laws of family process, but one of them is actually 2 laws. I stepped out of the screen just for a moment because I wanted to introduce you to a book that I found to be very helpful. This definitely was one of my textbooks in graduate school, and I have listed it on the final page of this presentation as the reference. This book is called Generation to Generation, Family Processes in Church and Synagogue. It's really not a theology book. It's a book on family therapy. And it happens to be the author, I believe he's a rabbi, and he describes how these laws of family process that he learned from family systems theory they play out in just about every other imaginable relational or social system that you can think of. I am going to look. I saw one more question pop up. It was the same thing about the audio check. So family systems theory, the family unit is an organizational system that functions according to natural laws that govern the structure of the relational system and the function of the individual members. What was very interesting about the development of family systems theory is that ideas from multiple disciplines were attributed to the development of systems theory. One of the first clinicians to really organize the family systems theory was Murray Bowen. He was a psychiatrist, and he worked with patients in a psychiatric care center, which was a very severely ill patients, particularly his work with patients with schizophrenia. And one of the things that he discovered or he observed, that the patients would stabilize in the hospital, but when they went back into the context where they came out from, they would destabilize again. And it caused him to want to utilize the relational system or that social context to assist in the therapeutic process. And with the influence also of some other forces that were at play, this was probably in the late 50s and the early 60s. Um, there was definitely the influence of physics into this. There were some anthropologists like Gregory Bateson who applied some of those concepts of cybernetics into understanding social units organization. There was the Palo Alto group, the Mental Research Institute, that really took a deep dive into the communication patterns of members of a family system. And so all of these have really contributed to our modern understanding of family systems theory. I'll say one thing too, as I'm in this introductory slide, is when I say the family unit, you can think relational system or even organizational system. I don't mean to imply any kind of gender bias or orientation bias or anything like that. We're talking about a group of individuals that usually have a hierarchy who are joined by some form of commitment, whether it be marriage or by birth or family relationship. But it is this organizational system that functions according to natural laws, and it influences the structure of the system as well as the function of the individuals. Now, this next statement I put there is it's almost like a mantra that I will often remind myself of to help me think beyond the individual whenever I'm conceptualizing analysis of a case or trying to really help someone overcome some kind of dysfunctional pattern in their life. And that is this, that systems have problems and people have symptoms. Think, I'm not going to go into any more detail on that, but you may want to write that down if you're taking notes. Systems have problems and people have symptoms. And that leads us to one of the concepts I'll get to in about 3 or 4 slides, and that is the idea of the identified patient. They're usually the symptom bearer. In my introductory slide, I talked about 2 terms. One was structure and one was function. Structure, let's look at that for a moment. The relationship system has a hierarchical structure and interpersonal boundaries that define the roles of individual members of the system. So in the structure of the system, there's this executive subsystem, which we often see played out as the parents, the parents of the children, if you're looking at a nuclear family unit here. If you want to apply this to an organizational structure, it might be the CEO, the owner. This is the executive subsystem, and it's occupied by the persons with the highest level of power and control in the system. They are the leaders, the influencers. Then you have the sibling subsystem, and the sibling subsystem, it's occupied by the persons in the system who are dependent on the executive system for survival, for power, for control, for leadership. The other concept was function. The individual members of the relationship system occupy specific roles that define their function in the relational system. Some concepts to keep in mind about function would be boundaries. Boundaries really define the rights and responsibilities of an individual, as well as what they understand or see as the rights and responsibilities of other members in that system. These are distinctions made by the individual that define the rights and responsibilities in the relational system. Oftentimes, too, the system will define boundaries. That can be healthy, but it also could be unhealthy. I think maybe one example that would be a healthy boundary would be the parents of a new infant who would take take one of those plastic plug safety devices, and they would fill in the holes that an electrical outlet has. That would be a good example of a safety measure that would put a boundary around something that could be harmful. But then there's other times where the relationship system may try to introduce boundaries that really do restrict someone's freedom and may even be oppressive. As the family system or as the relational system grows and matures, as individuals in that system become more competent, it's important for boundaries to be flexible. So another concept in the function are roles. Roles are the purpose that an individual serves in the relationship system. Now, roles define behaviors and expectations for the individual who occupies that role. And these roles are not necessarily universal, although some of you may have seen that model to describe the roles in a family system or in particular, I see this quite often in the literature or in patient education documents related to a substance use disorder problem. You'll see the person with a substance use disorder, you'll see the enabler, and then under that, you'll see the roles that oftentimes the children in that system play, like the hero, the scapegoat, the mascot, the lost child. So those are some examples of roles in the family system and the relational system. Another few words here about function is that the function of each member of the system, it's defined by the role they occupy. That role pretty much scripts out what it is that their role is, or what kind of behaviors are expected, what kind of behaviors are tolerated. The relationship system has rules that define acceptable and expected behavior for the individual members. And the pathological symptom that manifests in an individual member of the system serves a function in the organization of the system. Now, I want to say a few words right here, maybe to put out a few fires. I do not want to in any way suggest that a person who has some kind of diagnosis of a mental disorder, that it's their parents' fault. I'm not at all assigning blame. Actually, you'll understand the idea of causation in the next couple of slides. But this model, it's not to point fingers or to blame or to in any way demean any particular member of the system, but it's important to understand that even when you work with an individual, that individual is part of a greater system. And there are sometimes there is a secondary gain that that person experiences by maintaining that symptom. And that would be an example of the function that that symptom plays. A couple more fundamental concepts from family systems theory. Actually, linear causality is not a concept of family systems theory, but it's more a contrast. Linear causality is this traditional understanding of psychopathology, and it defines pathology as the effect of some biological or psychological cause that's within the individual. When we look at a problem from a linear causality perspective, typically the interventions focus on resolving the symptoms of the dysfunction in the individual. That might include medication or individual psychotherapy. I will say though, sometimes when symptom becomes more the focus, what happens is treatment is for the symptom, but not for the cause. Let's look to the next concept here, and this is the concept from family systems theory about causality, and it's circular causality. And that is that in systems theory, our understanding is that psychopathology, and it defines pathology as a symptom exhibited by an individual in that system, and it serves some kind of organizational, the organizational dysfunction that's caused by multiple interactional processes. There we go. I'm going to read that verbatim one more time. Circular causality is the systems theory understanding of psychopathology and defines pathology as a symptom exhibited by an individual as a manifestation of some organizational dysfunction caused by multiple interactional processes. That's the idea of circular causality. It's not linear, and it isn't even really cyclical, but it would be like the spokes of a wheel looking at all these interactional processes that are contributing to the development of the problem. And this goes back to that concept that I presented at the very beginning of the presentation, which was that systems have problems and the individuals in the system have symptoms. With the family systems model, interventions focus on resolving the dysfunction in the family process. And the interventions we use there would be conjoint interactional family therapy, communication, structure, and function concepts that are interventions that focus on helping people to become more flexible with boundaries. That would have to do with structure as well as function. It might move people to become more responsible for something they may not be taking responsibility for, or it might be them releasing responsibility of something that really is not their responsibility. The identified patient, I mentioned this earlier, the identified patient is the member of the system who manifests some symptom that represents stress or pathology of the relationship. The identified patient can then be sacrificed, and I use that in quotes, but it is a idea that sometimes the more powerful members of the system can then focus attention maybe in a way to rescue this identified patient, and then they appear to be benevolent and helpful. But the identified patient then can be sacrificed by the family system through labeling, diagnosis, and treatment so that the system can stay the same and continue in the familiarity of their dysfunctional processes. Another concept in family systems theory is this concept of homeostasis. Homeostasis is another word for balance, and it's a tendency of an organizational system to strive in self-corrective ways to preserve the organizing principles of its existence. When the balance of the system is disrupted, the system activates mechanisms of control to suppress the deviation. And we see this in examples like rebellion. You know, healthy rebellion, when I say healthy rebellion, that could be the example maybe of an adolescent say to their parents, hey, I think I'm going to get a job and move out and start paying my own bills. I'm sure there's a lot of parents out there who would love to hear that from their child. But sometimes if there's too much togetherness or closeness in this phase of the family life cycle, where there should be this flexibility for an adolescent to grow up and launch from the family system, sometimes it gets suppressed, and parents will say things like, well, you don't have any skills, you're not smart enough for college, you'll never be able to take care of yourself, you'll never make it without our help. And this is an example of feedback that tries to suppress the deviation. Actually, we call the rebellion process as positive feedback that has a trajectory to go beyond the boundaries of the system, and then negative feedback are strategies that suppress that deviation. When positive feedback is actually done in a healthy way, like a child or an adolescent or a young adult launching from their family of origin, what it can do then is it can expand the complexity of the system, and it can expand the functioning of the individuals in that system and result in a recalibration of boundaries and a change in the system to accommodate the deviation in a way that really is a healthy progression, a healthy maturational process. Another very important concept that Murray Bowen presented was the idea of differentiation of self. Differentiation of self is the degree to which an individual member is able to define themselves as an autonomous being independent of the system. Differentiation of self enables the individual to have a distinct identity apart from the system. Differentiation of self, it's this ability to remain a non-anxious presence in the context of an anxious system. And differentiation of self, it's about the degree of wholeness and autonomy that that individual in the relationship system has. And it really is important for the management of stress and anxiety. You'll see this in one of the laws of family process that I'll explain later on, which is the paradox of seriousness and playfulness. But there are times where it's important for there to be a voice of reason in the midst of an overreaction that can bring about this stabilization. And when a person is able to be different and autonomous, sometimes they can see things more clearly in that system. The extended family field is the force. Some of y'all watched The Rise of Skywalker. It got released on Disney Plus the other day. 3 days ago was May 4th, which is May the 4th be with you. Skywalker Day, or shall I say Star Wars Day. But just like the force is this field of energy that pulls people and binds people together, as I think Obi-Wan Kenobi said in one of the first Star Wars, the extended family field is this field of energy, of influence that exerts on each individual member of the family system. And even when they have moved away from the family of origin, or where they're no longer in that nuclear family, maybe they've gone forward and developed their own sense of identity and independence, or developed their own family, that extended family field continues to exert influence on their specific patterns of behavior, as well as their beliefs and attitudes about issues like sex, about parenting, loyalty, money, territory, substance use, spirituality, morality, and other kinds of values. The emotional triangle, and I'm sure many of you have heard of this about triangles, it can actually be a healthy stabilizing factor. It also can be a dysfunctional enabling process, but the emotional triangle is formed as a stabilizing function to bring balance to a relational dyad. That's two people, by distributing stress of that dyad over 3 times the relational real estate. I came up with this idea one time when I was drawing a triangle, and if you have a pad of paper taking notes on, you could just draw a line between 2 dots. Those are 2 people that are in a relational dyad, and you'll see there's one line of connection. But if you're to add a 3rd dot, just 1 dot, 1 more person, you'll notice that it creates 2 more lines of connection. So what you have now is 3 times the relational real estate. That's the term I'm using to describe that. Instead of all the stress being spread out between that, on that 1 line of relationship, now you have 3 lines. Now, sometimes the stress needs to be on that 1 line so that that 1 line can recalibrate, make adjustments, be more flexible. But there's other times where maybe the 3rd person coming in can bring some clarity, can distribute a bit of the stress, can validate a concern here or there, and come to a negotiated conclusion that seems to be acceptable to all 3 of the person. So conflict in a dyad can be de-escalated by that 3rd person entering into the dyad and absorbing the distress into 2 or more relational links. So here we are at the beginning of Module 2. I'll just say a couple things in summary of Module 1. I want you to understand that these laws of family process and these concepts from family systems theory, some of you may already be thinking about cases that you've worked with, or you may even be thinking about your own family of origin. I don't want you to see these as dysfunctions or as bad. These are like gravity. These are forces. These are laws at work in relational systems. And it's important to be aware of their presence so that when they do appear to be out of balance or dysfunctional, that you as a clinician can go to work in the relationship system to try and make boundaries more flexible or recalibrate the system. So again, I just want to clarify, it's not good or bad on any of these. Some of these processes can be very important for the survival of the system. Also, they can inhibit growth. They can handicap functioning of the individuals in that system. I'm going to look at the Q&A bubble. I saw a question pop up, and I'll see if, what was the second identified individuals of the structure? I'm going to go back to that slide on structure to see if that answered the question. Okay, there you go. Hopefully that gives you your answer. The executive subsystem, the ones with the power and control, and then the sibling subsystem. Now, when I call it the sibling subsystem, actually I didn't come up with that term. That's what family systems theory refers to it as. That sibling subsystem doesn't necessarily have to consist of children that are related with the same parents. Again, I want you to think about organizational systems. Some of you will see this at play in work environments. You'll see this at play in political organizations. I saw another question pop up. Yes, thank you. Okay, we've answered that question. And I do appreciate you using the question. You definitely don't need to overwhelm me with questions. We're right on time. We're going to be able to get through all of this material today. The other thing is I thought about adding a third module about implications for therapy, but I'm going to be integrating that into the whole process. And I'll give you a preview of that right now. In terms of the implication for theory, I really want to challenge you all to think systemically. It doesn't mean you're going to have to do family therapy with every one of your clients, although I personally think that that can be very advantageous. You can do family therapy even with one person in the room by noticing the influence of that extended family field and looking for these dysfunctional processes and helping that individual to do what they can to enhance their own functioning or to achieve a higher, I'd say, and to achieve a higher level of differentiation of their self. Emotional distance. This is a law of family process. Emotional distance is the degree to which members of the system are able to emotionally differentiate from the whole of the system. Emotional distance, it's a rhythm of closeness and separateness that is essential for healthy functioning, growth, and maturity of the system. Too much closeness when separation is optimal, or too much separation when closeness is optimal, can be dysfunctional. I have worked extensively with families that had a substance use disorder, and I've seen some inappropriate application of separation. Now, I don't mean to be critical of anyone's clinical model. I'm really just talking about my own personal experiences. But I have seen family systems that have responded to a substance use disorder with very rigid boundaries that have often looked like somebody being exiled from their family of origin. And it's not always, it may exert pressure on somebody to go into treatment and to receive help. It also can be very traumatic. I remember one case that I was working with, and it really appeared that going into treatment was a traumatic event for the family, and that the way that an intervention occurred and the consequence in it in terms of the way people treated each other with this high degree of separation, it really undermined the connection and the empathy and the intimacy that was existing in that family. So there are appropriate times for strong boundaries and separation, and there are also times for close, tight connection. The important thing is this idea of a rhythm, that over the life cycle of the family or over the life cycle of the individual, as well as the experience of stress and critical situations in a person's life, there's this important rhythm. I mentioned earlier about this historic event that we're in right now with uh, the the COVID-19 pandemic. I actually have 4 children myself. One of them is still in high school and she lives in our home, but the other 3 were scattered around across the nation. And when the traditional classrooms in college shut down and everything went to online, there was this migration back to our family of origin, to our nuclear family, the family home. And that would be an example of where there was this fear, this anxiety, this uncertainty about the future. And we've seen this in so many families where people that may have been far away, they've come in a close connection because they felt that safety and security in their relational system. Loss and replacement. The relational system has a natural tendency to replace loss. And there's times where loss is a functional process in the natural development of a family life cycle. I think of times where a adolescent launches from the family of origin, or sometimes during divorce or separation. That's an example of loss. And it's important for the system to recalibrate and to adapt, to grieve the loss and come to a place of growth and maturity. And that may take time. In some cases, it may take several months. In some cases, it may even take a couple years. But there are certain periods of time that would be appropriate to grieve a loss. I know I don't want to just give standardized periods of time here because some of them take a little bit longer. But in the example of a person in recovery from a substance use disorder, I would say it's quite common in treatment settings that counselors will encourage the patient, particularly if they were in a very dysfunctional relationship that had a high degree of substance use in it. They may tell them to avoid getting into a romantic relationship for their first year of sobriety. That would be a good example of how there was this healthy period of grieving the loss and recalibrating before that loss was replaced. Because sometimes the pain of loss can motivate a person to replace what was lost before the growth and the change that was necessary has occurred. The speed at which loss is replaced can relieve pain, but it can also prevent growth and maturity of the system. Another law of family process is this idea of chronic conditions. If a relational system problem is chronic, there must be a reactive or adaptive feedback from somewhere in the system to sustain it. Now, I thought of one of the TV shows I like to watch sometimes, particularly when there's nothing else on TV, or I'm tired of hearing about all of the emergency declarations and all the horrible, outcomes with our pandemic right now. I like to watch that Forensic Files. I think kind of that was one of my secret uh, vocations that I wanted to do when I was younger, which was to be a detective. In many ways, what we do in mental health care is very thorough analysis of a scene, a person's psyche, or a family system. But I've seen episodes of some of those forensic files where it was investigating an arson. And there have been more than one occasions where it turned out that the person who started the fire was the firefighter. And often they'll have some kind of a analysis of their personality, and in a way that that person had this dimension of their identity that they're the hero to go rescue the family from a fire. And instead of just waiting for there to be a need for rescue, they created a situation where there was a need for rescue. So that's an example there of seeing how some chronic conditions may actually serve some adaptive function for another member in the family. Irresponsibility and over-responsibility. Some parents have a difficult time coming to terms with the loss of their role as a parent or or the loss of a child who needs them. And sometimes that's how we see these chronic conditions where there's a lot of enabling going on with a parent to try and rescue a child who's fully capable of taking care of themselves. It just may take a little longer and it may experience a little bit of pain, but those processes are important for growth and maturity. Another concept that I've alluded to a little bit is this idea of pain and responsibility. I'll say in my work, particularly with the opioid epidemic that we have seen really emerge in the last 10 years or so, um, I've come to a conclusion or a realization that many times when a person develops a dependence on opioids, that when they're in their recovery process, when they're in that initial sobriety, one of the essential thoughts that need to change is their tolerance of pain. I think a lot of people become intolerant of pain and then they seek out some kind of relief instead of learning to cope with a pain that may be a natural kind of a loss. Uh, I'm really not that old, but I am in my 50s, and there's times where it's just a little bit slower getting started in the morning. Fatigue may set in a little sooner at the end of the day. And I really don't need to take a stimulant. I don't need to take a hit of methamphetamine to overcome that fatigue. What I really should do is listen to my body, maybe go begin exercising or have a better work-life balance. So there's an example of sometimes pain can tell your body to do something different to cure the cause of the pain. If a member of the relational system can successfully increase their tolerance for another's pain, their own threshold will increase, thus expanding their own range of functioning. An example too that's just probably very common that everyone experienced this is the example of teaching a child how to ride a bicycle. Now, none of us want our children to break their arm or skin their knee when they're learning to ride a bicycle, but the reality of it is they're gonna fall off the bike at least once, maybe twice. Some kids may have exceptional balance and they never fall, but it's good to do that maybe in a place that's grassy, it's got a soft surface, or on carpet or something like that. And it's important for the learning process sometimes for people to experience the natural order of discomfort or pain that experience maybe as a consequence of their irresponsible behavior. And if the rest of the system can tolerate this discomfort, so many times you'll hear a parent say, I just want my children to be happy. Well, the reality of it is life is full of very frustrating and stressful and discouraging and sad and disappointing moments. And so it's really not the goal, I think, of healthy family development for the child to just always be happy, but instead I'd rather see my children learn to tolerate discomfort and to learn from mistakes. And if a parent can allow that to happen, then the child will be put in a position where they can do what's necessary to grow and to mature. This is the law of family process. There's actually two of them, and it's the paradox of seriousness and the paradox of playfulness. And that is the seriousness with which families approach their problems can be more the cause of their difficulty than the effect of their problem. So an example with this seriousness, I know this may sound a little bit risque, but we're all mental health providers and we should be able to talk about this. But you'll hear the classic example of a parent maybe discovering that their child was masturbating. Now, that's really a normal kind of experience that many children and adolescents begin to become more familiar with their sexuality and with arousal. And it's not a serious problem if a child were to engage in that kind of behavior in their shower, the bathtub, or whatever. And again, I don't want to get off into sex addiction. I realize that that can be a very serious problem as well. But the degree to the seriousness at which the system responds to a normal process that they may have some kind of objection to can actually be more the cause of the problem than the effect of it. So it's really important to have a flexible perspective, understand. Playfulness can serve as a stabilizing function as remedial power to the seriousness of a perceived problem. I can actually remember an event in my own family when one of the grandchildren was roller skating in the house, and it probably was my fault. I may have said, okay, y'all just heard me even reference riding a bicycle on carpet. But one of the children was roller skating, one of the grandchildren was roller skating in grandmother's house, and they lost their balance and they knocked over a very special collection of a teapot and dishes and things like that. And I can remember it seemed like the clang of dishes hitting the floor continued for 30 seconds or longer. And when finally that last plate finally finished its little circular kind of flopping around, there was this dead silence in the house for quite a while. Grandmother's face was horrified, but then one of the children started laughing, and it diffused the entire situation, because really the beautiful thing about that moment wasn't the teapot. The beautiful thing about that moment was grandchildren and the children and the grandparents all together in the home having some kind of playful experience. So you'll see there, it's important that there be balance and there be an objective kind of reality to this. Another concept in family systems here is this, or the laws of family process, is this idea of secrets in the system, and systems. Secrets delineate the system along lines of who knows the secret and who does not know the secret. And I really appreciated what Friedman said in his book in discussing this law of family process. He said that secrets are the plaque in the arteries of communication. So many times you could think in your own life of how you were having a conversation with someone who you knew a secret about, and it really restrained your authenticity. It really restrained your ability to connect on a deep and real intimate basis. And that's what secrets do. And secrets can also exacerbate other pathological processes by keeping the system anxiety at a very high level. And I'm talking about problems that have nothing to do with the secret. There's just this tension in the family, and their tolerance for tension is at its max. Sometimes even the smallest thing can result in a critical mass. Sibling position. Sibling position is the position a person occupies in this sibling constellation. And you can apply this to work environments as well, kind of where a person falls in the organizational chart. But the position a person occupies in the sibling constellation of the nuclear family of origin will exert influence on the expectations about leadership, responsibility, success, and gender. Now, I am not going to go into some prediction about birth order, although birth order has a very high correlation with personality traits and sibling position. We're not just talking about the order in which a person was born, but it has to do as well with the role that that sibling plays. Symmetry. I think I have two more here, and that'll finish us with about 5 minutes left for some questions. On symmetry, for every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. Again, this is a law of physics here. And just as that law works in physics, we have this at work in family systems. There are cycles of centripetal force, which pulls people together, like this COVID-19 pandemic. When there's times of illness or sickness or death, it usually pulls families together, or even birth on that matter, or marriage. It's a centripetal force that pulls the family together. And oftentimes, in that same sense, it's met by a centrifugal force at work that pushes those members of the system out. So that's the concept of symmetry. There's this, for every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. And then survival. The relational system will respond to a challenge in such a way to ensure the survival of the relational system. There's the reference for the book that I had mentioned earlier. I'll show it one more time for those of you that may have joined in later. It's a book called Generation to Generation by Edwin Freeman. There was also, I didn't list it here on the reference page, but Family Therapy and Clinical Practice by Murray Bowen. I think it was probably, maybe it was second edition in the 80s. It was back there decades ago. So those are some references. We have some time for questions. I'm going to go. One more thing too, I might talk about implications for therapy. I told you I would do that throughout the presentation. So the implications for therapy is to be aware of this family emotional field, that understands sometimes those forces are at work in an individual, and those forces may really not be functional for this person at where they are in their life. Be aware of these processes and use them in a healthy way. One of the other forms of therapy that I'm very that I really do appreciate, and I use it quite extensively, is dialectical behavior therapy, and it talks about this dichotomy between acceptance and change. And so when we think of these laws of family process, that sometimes these laws help us to accept these dynamics, and sometimes they help us to identify areas where there needs to be change. I'm going to look at the question, the slide on sibling position. Yeah, I did move through those last few pretty quick. I'll drop out on that. Okay, here's the one on sibling position. The position a person occupies in the sibling constellation of the nuclear family of origin will exert influence on the expectations about leadership, responsibility, success, and gender. You know, sometimes sibling position gets replaced too, that one of the younger children, when an older one moves away, they may rise up and kind of take the position. Had one more question. I'm going to do this for another moment. I will go to the survival slide. You probably have had time to write that down if you need to. The last one was on survival. Is that the relational system will respond to a challenge in such a way to ensure the survival of the relational system. I left that last word out. Well, folks, I really have enjoyed being with you today. We still have about 5 more minutes. I saw one more question here, and that is sibling position. What about the role of an only child in the system? You know, that is a good question. What I said earlier, sometimes what we see in that dynamic is that the only child will cycle through different roles, and they may end up at different phases in their life be all of those roles. Sometimes too, there may be extended members of the family or step siblings that might also be kind of put into that organizational structure. Isn't culture, this is another question, isn't culture a major variable in understanding systems? Can we consider some generalizations, or should our understanding be specific or be culture specific? That is a very good question. I would say that these laws of family process are universal, but each family system, what is acceptable or normal or culturally appropriate, is going to be quite different. And I appreciate that question, because I should remind us all right now that as a family therapist, it's important for us to come to understand the system with which that person experiences. And when it comes to cultural ideals that really do not violate some kind of fundamental human right, like slavery is a cultural ideal that violates fundamental human rights, that is universally wrong. Other things like the incest taboo or the molestation of children, although there may still be some pockets in the world where culturally that may be acceptable, it's a fundamental violation of a human right. So it's important as a family therapist that you're non-judgmental about people's cultural practices. Well, another one that I've heard of, I don't know if I'm using this term right, but I think I've heard of it as honor killing. And that might be the example where an executive member of a family system deems that one of the other members of that family system was acting dishonorably, and they felt they had some kind of cultural right to kill that person. Again, that's a fundamental violation of a human right of life. So thank you for the question about culture, and I want you to tread lightly there. But when it comes to violation of fundamental human rights, then it's very important to lay down a more universally appropriate kind of a boundary. But when it comes to individual things like whether or not an adolescent child has a green stripe dyed into their hair, although some cultures might find that terribly offensive and disrespectful, it also might be an appropriate expression for a child in 2020 in a metropolitan American culture. Well, folks, as I said, I really enjoyed being with you today. I appreciate the questions that were asked, and I hope that you have a wonderful afternoon. Thank you for joining us, and that will conclude this seminar.